Navalny actually he undertook an investigation himself and pretended to be an official in the Russian government and spoke to one of the people who played a role in the poisoning, who was called Kudryavtsev, and he essentially got him to confess to the poisoning. So yeah, I think it's the almost shock factor of it. And I guess the fact with Navalny that they'd done it once before and they've done it seemingly again, there's a kind of sort of, I guess, stubborn nature to him using that tactic. It's sort of reinforcing the fear of the way he governs.
I'm sure this won't be the last. I think it is absolutely devastating that Navalny is not with us, because he has had, and I'm sure still has, a lot of support in Russia. And the only chance of getting rid of Putin, whatever comes, might be worse than Putin, but it will be worse in Russia.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen. And today we're talking about Vladimir Putin's use of poison squads to assassinate his political enemies. Joining me is Times News reporter Lottie Hayton, who's written on a variety of topics, including Russia's use of Novichok. Lottie, welcome.
Thank you.
And also delighted to be joined by chemical weapons expert and former tank commander Hamish De Bretton-Gordon. Hamish, welcome back to Frontline.
Thanks for having me.
Just wanted to start with you, Hamish, and obviously we're talking in the wake of Alexei Navalny's death. There's a lot of speculation as to the exact circumstances of his death. What is your reading of what probably happened to him?
Well, without wanting to be too speculative, I'm pretty certain that he was murdered. First of all, the Russians claim that he had something called sudden cardiac death syndrome. It's a syndrome that I have. I might say if you know you've got it, it's very, very treatable. But he didn't look like somebody the day before is somebody who would have had that syndrome. So I think we can probably discount that. The other two hypotheses, first of all, he was killed by what people are calling a killer punch, which to me is sort of a little bit out of the sort of James Bond 007 world of super fiction novels. I know a few people in this sort of arena, and when you talk to them about this and the plausibility about killing somebody with a single punch below the solar plexus to the heart, it's certainly not a sure way of doing it. And somebody like Navalny, he looked reasonably fit. It strikes me as being, that is very unlikely. When it comes on to the actual poisoning, now his wife and also his mother have claimed that it was some sort, and they do mention Novichok. Now, Novichok is synonymous with the Russians, and as we'll discuss, the Russian Secret Service, which of course is born out of Putin. That is his background. He's not a soldier. He was a spy. It is a favoured method of getting rid of people, that they don't want, who oppose them. And the fact that Navalny had already been poisoned with Novichok before, some might say, well, it didn't kill him the first time, so why use it a second time? Well, I think the Russians are pretty hacked off. It didn't kill him the first time. It certainly should have done. But a lot of various things happened that perhaps shouldn't have done, which they didn't envisage, which meant that, first of all, he got injected with atropine, which is a way of stalling the march of a nerve agent like Novichok. And eventually he got to Berlin, where he's properly treated. So he shouldn't have died. He probably wouldn't have had any residue in his system, and he might still have had some issues from the Novichok. But how he died, and the fact that sort of talk about bruising on his body, it strikes me as had they dropped a drop of Novichok on his tongue, for instance, and held him down, that would have killed him very, very quickly. And lots of people say, what about the people who are doing the poisoning? It's the same with the Salsbury thing. The Russian agents who took the Novichok to Solsbury didn't have any protective equipment, mainly because Novichok is non-volatile. It doesn't really give anything off. If you swallow it or touch it, it's absolutely deadly. But it's fairly little damage or threat to people around it. So I think on the balance of evidence, sadly, it looks like we are not going to see a post-mortem. Certainly not a post-mortem in a proper forensic laboratory that we're ever going to find out exactly how he died. So on the balance of possibilities, I think Novichok or a similar poison is probably the way he went, and I'm pretty certain the Russians killed him.
You mentioned Novichok and its use, of course, in the Solsbury poisonings. That's how most people in the UK will think of it. We'll come on to that in due course. Lottie, I just wanted to ask you a bit more about the first time that Alexei Navalny was poisoned, and we know for certain in that case it was Novichok. Just talk us through what happened in that instance.
Yeah, so Navalny was exposed to Novichok after boarding a flight to Moscow from the Siberian city of Tomsk. And he very quickly became unwell. The pilot made an unauthorized detour and he received some life-saving treatment in Germany. Later on, Navalny actually undertook an investigation himself and pretended to be an official in the Russian government and spoke to one of the people who played a role in the poisoning, who was called Kudryavtsev. And he essentially got him to confess to the poisoning. So he found out that they had put the Novichok in his underwear. And that's on putting it on, he then got onto the plane and then became ill.
I mean, given that, how remarkable was it that Navalny managed to survive that assassination attempt?
Yeah, it was really surprising. And he actually asked Kudryavtsev on the call, and he said that it was due to that flight. And it was very likely that they expected him to die. And it was just because of the action that pilot took.
It's also notable as well, as you mentioned, Lottie, that it was Alexei Navalny himself and the research he undertook afterwards that has brought to light some of the facts we now know about Putin's use of these poison squads.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess it's sort of two parts. There's him, and Bellingcat has undertaken a really extensive investigation and sort of revealed the length of time for which these things have been going on. They suspect the first incidence was in 1995, but obviously there is a longer history of sort of Soviet use of poison. But yeah, he found out a lot himself, and his family is continuing to do that in some of the news stories you'll see coming out. They're very committed to finding out more.
Hamish, why does Putin and why do the FSB use Novichok so much as a nerve agent? If it failed to kill Navalny in 2020, if it didn't end up killing the scruples in Solsbury, why do they use it so much?
Well, that's a really good question. I think, first of all, just investigate why it didn't work with Sergei Skripal and with Navalny. Now, I mentioned it's a non-volatile chemical. Both with Navalny and Skripal, basically the nerve agent was on their skin, and it's what we call a dermal ingestion. In other words, the chemical has to work through your skin, and your skin is really good at keeping things out. So it took about 4 hours for the Novichok to get into Skripal and his daughter Yulia's system before it started having an effect. Similarly with Navalny, he had the stuff in his underpants and it took a few hours to work. We know that the basic treatment for nerve agent, be it Novichok, be it sarin, be it VX, is atropine. We know that the medics who attended him on that flight that was diverted, and the pilot was told, do not land. Where that pilot is now, I assume he's digging salt in the Urals somewhere. So he broke the rules. A medic injected Navalny with atropine. The reason that Skripal survived, because he probably had a bigger dosage, he was injected with atropine at Salisbury Hospital by coincidence, and I think this is in the public domain. There was an army doctor who was running A&E at Salisbury at the time, who was an expert in this sort of stuff. So they injected Skripal with about 30 injections of atropine. Now, when we go into battle, we take atropine with us in case we get infected with nerve agents. And it very clearly says only 2 of these things, 3 in extremis. So the fact that they injected Skripal with 30 and he survived is amazing. So I think that's why both of them survived. They shouldn't have done, which is why I said if you put a drop on somebody's tongue, they're going to die almost instantaneously. Now, why did the Russians use it? I think it is part of the whole terror network that Putin and the FSB and the GRU have developed. They want to terrify anybody who opposes them, which is why there are so many of these cases of people being poisoned. Litvinenko with Polonium-210. I mean, even going back to Georgy Markov on Waterloo Bridge here in 1976 with ricin, which is a biological toxin, but the same sort of group of poisons. So it's that terror thing, and also it is sort of traceability or deniability. Now, when they used Novichok against Sergei Skripal, we officially didn't really know about it. And of course, we actually did know, because one of the people who designed Novichok back in the 80s and 90s actually defected to this country and worked at Porton Down for a while. So we had a pretty good idea of what Novichok was all about. But it was one of those things, there was no public demonstration of that. Because, quite often you don't want your enemy to know what you know. And the fact that Porton Down and others really knew how to treat Skripal was because of a lot of the work presumably they'd done before. And the reason Navalny survived as well is because when he got to Berlin, they were obviously straight on the phone to the UK, or the UK the other way around, saying, right, this is what you need to do to make them survive. So I think, going back to your original question, it's all about the terror thing. You oppose us and we're going to get rid of you. Now, we're not going to shoot you in the head, which will be easy and painless for you. We are going to make you suffer. And anybody who opposes Putin and his goons is always concerned. What am I touching? What is it that might kill me? And I think what we've learned really since Solsbury and since Navalny is an awful lot about Novichok. I mean, Novichok was supposed to be defunct in the 90s. Now, in September 2017, a year before, or 6 months before the Skripal attack, Putin has gone on the public stage saying, we have got rid of all our chemical weapons. You Americans, you haven't, and a few others, aren't you terrible? And then 6 months later, we then discover, well, actually, and what Bellingcat have said in other studies that they've done is that, Russia has an extant chemical weapons program based around Novichok, which we weren't supposed to know anything about. And some of the attributes of Novichok, it's undetectable. One of the issues with doing a post-mortem on Navalny is there is no there are probably detectors now, but certainly when Skripal was poisoned, that would actually pick this stuff up. Again, without wanting to overstate it, because it's non-volatile. To detect something, you need something that you can sniff and smell, and you don't get that with Novichok. But it absolutely has a template of a place called Shikany, where it's made outside Moscow, which, interestingly enough, 6 weeks after the Solsbury attack, this massive base that developed Novichok with about 40,000 people on it was flattened, was razed to the ground. I gave this information to some journalists who actually went out there and saw it, and it was nothing to be seen. So that had moved away. So I think it's that terror thing. It's that this is us, and the fact that it's undetectable. Then you get into this deniability, which is why the Russians are going, oh well, no, it's probably MI6 who did it, or the CIA, but without any evidence, without any forensic examination of Navalny's body, nobody will be able to say for certain.
We should probably just take a moment, actually, Lottie, just to explain exactly what happened in Solsbury, because in the UK, we are very, very familiar with the circumstances, but just for viewers and listeners overseas, just talk us through what did happen.
Yeah, so the Salsbury poisonings, or Skripal poisonings, were in March 2018, and it was a botched assassination of Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia. And in other cases, it's been identified and linked to the FSB, who is Russia's security agency. But in this case, it was, they think, GRU agents, who are another body within the Russian intelligence system. And from what we've found by looking at CCTV, identifying various elements, they think that the GRU agents, and as you said, there's a lot of danger to them, so they sort of have to go up. It's unlikely that they'll get a situation where they can sort of give someone tea or ingest it orally. So the agents found the location of the Skripal's house, and they went there, and they think that they had a fake Nina Ricci bottle of perfume and sprayed the door handle. So when Skripal and his daughter left to go for lunch, they touched the door handle, and it went onto their skin that way. And then they went to lunch, they went to Zizi's, and they left lunch, had lunch, went for a walk in the park, and at that point began to start feeling ill. And Skripal sort of collapsed. His daughter was seeming unwell, and passers-by noticed and contacted the ambulance services. So it was because passers-by found them that they were taken to hospital.
And then subsequently, and truly tragically, a British citizen died, Dawn Sturgis, who came into contact with the Novichok.
Yeah, so the circumstances around that are still not completely clear, but they think that someone she knew, Charlie Rowley, found a perfume bottle, gave it to her, and she then sprayed it on her skin. And yeah, she, a British citizen, later died. But it's believed the incident was linked because of the circumstances of how that was disposed of, but it seems as if that wasn't an intentional target.
Hamish, this may be a slightly grim question, but were I to be exposed to Novichok now, what would I feel? What would the effects, the immediate effects, be on me or anyone else who was exposed to it?
Well, there are two scenarios here. First of all, the scenario that Lottie has described, what happened in Salsbury, where you get it on your skin and then it takes a while to work through the body. There's the other scenario that I'm suggesting might be what happened in Navalny, where somebody drops a drop on their tongue and then it's straight into your system. Basically, all nerve agents destroy your nerves. They attack an enzyme called cholinesterase, which basically stops your nerves working. If your nerves don't work, your heart stops, your lungs stop, so you very quickly sort of suffocate and die a horrible way, which is why atropine is so important, because it reverses the blocking of cholinesterase, as it were. So, but Novichok itself is at the extreme end of nerve agents. I usually say, chlorine, which is something that, I've investigated so often in Syria, been used against civilians, and it's tremendously effective. But if you think chlorine is toxicity 1, the first nerve agent developed by the Nazis in 1939, something called sarin, would be toxicity 5000. You then look at VX, which was made famous when the North Koreans murdered Kim Jong-un, which was a brother of the president, in Kuala Lumpur airport. That would be toxicity 10,000. You then look at Novichok and we're looking at toxicity 100,000. So it is incredibly toxic. And that's it. But basically they work in the same way. They destroy your nerves. And if you get a dose, and the terrible thing about Dawn Sturgis, she had the biggest dose of anybody in all this, be it Navalny, be it Sergei Skripal or Yulia Skripal. As Lottie said, we think she sprayed the alleged perfume bottle on herself, got a big dose, and she was that was her, unfortunately. Going back to Solsbury, we are talking a tiny amount of agent, less than half an egg cup. And one of the challenges was it took us 18 months to clean up Solsbury because you had no way of detecting it. Say you got Novichok in this room, you would have to sample every square millimetre to see if there was Novichok there. And if there was, you'd clean it up and then have to do it again. If you have to do that, we know that the Skripals went to about 5 or 6 different places on that Sunday, the 4th of March, 2018. Basically, we had to go to every place, cordon it off, and sample it down to the last blade of grass. And if there was any confusion of whether anything was there, it was destroyed. I mean, the amount of, I think it was 37 vehicles are buried somewhere because they're thought to have Novichok, but we couldn't prove it. The thousands of tons of material taken from Solsbury the same sort of way. So yeah, a very rambling answer to your question, but Novichok is really the top end of nerve agents, but they're all horrendous. They're all illegal under the Chemical Weapons Convention, which Russia has signed. But we know that most things that Russia said are 180 degrees diametrically opposed to the truth, and this is another one of them.
And I suppose what you can see here is the pattern between Navalny, between what happened in Solsbury, even going back to Alexander Litvinenko, who was poisoned and killed back in 2006, of Vladimir Putin using poison to target his political opponents. Just on Litvinenko, now that wasn't Novichok, but just talk us through what happened there, Lottie.
Yeah, so he died in 2006 after drinking a tea which was laced with a radioactive isotope called Polonium-210. And he had fled to the UK. He was a former officer of the FSB, and he specialised in tackling organised crime, but he then became a very outspoken critic of the Putin regime. He said he'd been looking into the assassination of a Russian journalist who'd received death threats and was shot in her Moscow apartment in the previous month. He was due to fly to Spain. He was investigating Spanish links to Russia, and two people that he was working with, he had tea with them in a London hotel, and from there became very quickly ill. So he didn't die that fast. He was in hospital for a while, and from hospital he accused Putin very directly of orchestrating his killing. And it was found that Dmitry Kovtun and Andrei Lugovoy were the two people that he was working with, and they are the main suspects in his murder.
Hamish, do you think we learned the right lessons from what happened to Litvinenko?
I'm not sure we did, but polonium is a really interesting isotope, and it absolutely firmly points at the Russians. It's a very rare isotope. It's an accelerant in making nuclear weapons. It costs, they reckon, $5 million a drop almost. So it's not something. It's not like uranium or something that you could buy on the dark web if you wanted to. It's highly refined. Only people who have nuclear weapons would have it, and to get hold of it. It also has the quality of a very short half-life. In other words, it doesn't hang around for very long. And if you want to poison somebody with something, there is that too, which makes it difficult. Although, the Millennium Hotel, which is not a million miles away from here, I think there's still a room in the hotel that's unusable because it's still contaminated with polonium-210. The converse to that is that radiological isotopes are relatively easy to identify because they give off a signature. So on the one hand, one could work out where it came from. And I think all the research that was done tracked, the BA jet that flew from Moscow to London with it on was, they could trace that because there's still traces there. They could trace it around London, but then in theory, after a few days, it would have disappeared anyway. But what we learned, well, whether we learned things or not, it's I think people in the security service community have always been well aware of this sort of stuff. And when we look back to Georgy Markov in '76, it is very much sort of James Bond type stuff. And that is not really generally what security agents do, in this country and elsewhere. It's only the Russians and, the other sort of axis of evil who actually go out and assassinate people. I mean, it's not, whatever we see in the latest James Bond film, I can assure you that people, in Vauxhall and elsewhere are not going out murdering opponents of this country every day. That doesn't happen, but it does happen in Russia. It does happen in Iran. It does happen in North Korea. And it should be no surprise. I think it is shocking to people in this country that we've got agents of a country like Russia walking around Solsbury, my hometown, claiming they're there for the beautiful spa and all the rest of it, all the while carrying the most deadly man-made chemical ever, and murdering somebody who admittedly he was a double agent, but he'd retired. His daughter was, she at the time was in her early 30s. Now, crikey, what a life she's got to look forward to. We haven't seen them in public for nearly 6 years now, so who knows what sort of life she's having. So I think it's no surprise generally to people who work in that environment. It's a hell of a shock to the population of this country and others to think that's going on, but without being too blasé or cynical about it, these things happen, and I think we should be reassured that we have a fantastic security service and others, counter-terrorist police, special forces, who are trying to make sure that this happens as infrequently as possible. And I'm sure an awful lot of stuff is interdicted, stopped happening, that we never hear about. But this is the way the Russians do business, and some of their like.
You mentioned Salisbury as your hometown, and for those who haven't been, it's a beautiful cathedral city in the west of England, very famous in its way. What was it like in the aftermath of that? There must have been ordinary people who've lived in Salisbury all their lives terrified to go out.
Oh, it was shocking. Funny enough, I was giving a talk in Abu Dhabi at the time on my life in Syria, looking for evidence of Assad's chemical attacks. And I came off stage and I had I'm rather repeating that's in my memoir, which is still available in all good bookshops, I might say. But I had about 60 text messages and emails and others saying, what's happening? Now, a lot of them were from residents of Solsbury, and I got back pretty soon after that. But yeah, a lot of journalists actually live in Solsbury as well, so who got involved in this, and people who were very experienced sort of journalists in the defence and security world were sort of going, Hamish, is it safe to go into Solsbury? And of course the impact that it has had on Solsbury. We have Stonehenge, which a world famous heritage site, sort of 5 miles north of Salisbury. 3.5 million Americans come and visit it every year. Suddenly that stopped. So from an economic impact, it was massive. But also the fact that I think, one of the challenge, and I wasn't, I was involved, and people know I was involved advising the government and talking to the press a lot as well, trying to articulate what was happening. But one of the things I found, politicians found it really difficult to understand. They understand bombs and bullets, that's straightforward. But when in my world, what we call bugs and smells, trying to explain to the Prime Minister or somebody else, what a nerve agent is, what does it mean? Does that mean everybody in Salisbury is going to die? No. We've got a tiny bit of this stuff, but potentially. And there were some unhelpful comments as well. I think somebody in authority had said, yeah, there's enough Novichok there to kill 500,000 people. So as you can imagine, then people are going, crikey, what can we do? And I was explaining, well, there are 500,000 molecules, and one molecule is enough to kill one person. But it's the likelihood of that happening is not at all. But because of that hysteria, is probably the wrong way. Because of the fear that it put into people, particularly in Salisbury, that's why the cleanup took so very long. Whereas, for somebody like myself, I would have said, yeah, I think it's fine. If there's any Novichok left, there might be a bit in the perfume bottle that was found, but the chances there's going to be any others. But very unlikely. Although without wanting to go on about this, the other thing at the time was some of the paranoia. As Lottie explains, they were in the park just outside the maltings when they were ill. There was a little boy who was seen picking. Yulia and Sergei apparently had been chucking bread around, and ducks were picking it up, and a little boy had picked them up. There's suddenly, if you find a dead duck within 5 miles of Salisbury, get it to Porton straight away, because it might be poisoned Novichok. Trying to find this little boy who had touched this stuff. And then apparently when they parked at the Maltings car park, they put £2 coins into the machine. There was then a massive police search to try and track down these pound coins that, without going into the details, were eventually found in Folkestone, I think. But it was that paranoia. And of course, they had no Novichok on them. No ducks died of Novichok poisoning, etc., which, I could have happily said I'm 99% sure that's the case. But if you're the Prime Minister or the MP in Salisbury or whatever else, they couldn't take that risk. So, yeah, again, answer to your question, it was very surreal. And of course, with troops all over Salisbury, people in Salisbury are quite used to seeing the military because we're on the edge of Salisbury Plain, the big military training area, and actually had that there are. The Russians say it must have been MI6 and us who did it because it was right next to Porton Down. There was all the military there. It was too smooth. Had it been in almost any other town, had it been in the north of England or Wales or Scotland, the outcome could have been very different, because we managed to flood the air with lots of troops who had protective equipment, knew how to operate in a contaminated environment. And of course, we had Porton Down just down the road with all the science capacity that has. And Salisbury Hospital, that every hospital in the country is designed to deal with, people who are contaminated or might have some sort of dreadful disease. But Salisbury is also designed to treat anybody if there's an accident at Porton Down. I think that that's no secret. So they had very good drills for dealing with this and not making it worse, because both Yulia and Sergei, still had Novichok on them. And one of the key lessons I learned in Syria from trying to help people who are involved in chemical attacks It's not the attack that's dangerous. It's the follow-up action. One of the hospitals I advised and trained near Damascus treated all the casualties from the massive chemical attack on the 21st of August 2013, which was actually sarin, another nerve agent. Of the 7 doctors who were treating that day, 5 of them died from cross-contamination because they didn't know what it is. And that is a history. It's the secondary effects that can be so terrible. And that could have happened in Solsbury if there weren't people who knew what to do and closed things down. But it was horrific. And if you want to have an impact, it's a bit like, if a terrorist could claim that COVID-19 was a terrorist event, it would be the biggest terror event ever in history. When you look at Solsbury, the fact it was front page news of the Times, the BBC for about 18 months, the bang for your buck, if Putin wanted to make a statement, he almost couldn't have done anything which would have had such an impact.
And Lottie, do you think that's part of the reason that Putin appears to use poisoning as a means to target his most vocal political opponents? Because it sends a message.
Yeah, I think it's as you mentioned, it's the sort of violence of the death, but I think it's also the covert nature of it. But the fact that, especially with Solsbury, it happened in the sort of heart of a relatively rural English town. It's so much more alarming than someone even being shot, which is also quite violent. And it seems, especially in Europe, and the US, it seems like such a distant thing. It doesn't happen here. So yeah, I think it's the almost shock factor of it. And I guess the fact with Navalny that they'd done it once before and they've done it seemingly again, there's a kind of sort of, stubborn nature to him using that tactic. It's sort of reinforcing the fear of the way he governs.
Hamish, final thought from you. I mean, to what extent do you think the Novichok is a particularly Putinesque weapon, being an ex-KGB man, wanting to make a statement, wanting to communicate fear to his political opponents? To what extent do you think Novichok is really a very Putinesque weapon?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, he is a tyrannical autocrat. He is ruled for so long because he's the biggest dog in the fight, and he is I think what people need to understand with Putin and his like, they have no scruples. They don't care about collateral damage. They don't care about civilian casualties. You just have to look at what they did in Syria and what they've done in Ukraine. The only thing they care about is power and holding on to power. And they will do anything to do it. I mean, we see some of the angst in Parliament just down the street here when people, get things wrong. But, that Russia, Moscow, the Kremlin is a world away. And Putin and his like will do anything to stay in power. They know that they are never going to be held to book, certainly not by their own people, although they're one of the slight positives. There is a bit of an undercurrent. People, Russia has tried to suppress as much outside information as possible, and their propaganda machine and their disinformation is just torrents. I mean, one of the things that I was trying to persuade politicians at the time was to respond quickly and positively to the Salsbury attack. On the 24 hours after the Salsbury attack, the Russians put out over 60 pieces of main media, be it on Russia Today or whatever, basically telling rubbish. And when I was speaking to people in Westminster, I was saying, you've got to respond to this. They were saying, oh, no, we need to make sure we get the facts right and everything else. I said, by the time you get the facts right, you've lost this battle. And that is something we're sort of beginning to learn. People down that road in Westminster don't like taking risks and don't like saying things unless they're absolutely certain. But that is exactly what Putin feeds off. He will say anything, do anything. And if he can maintain that advantage, he will do. And it's very difficult for a democratic society like ours to try and oppose that sort of stuff. So I think I'm sure this won't be the last. I think it is absolutely devastating that Navalny is not with us, because he has and I'm sure still has a lot of support in Russia. And the only chance of getting rid of Putin, whatever comes, might be worse than Putin, but it will be worse in Russia. What we need to do is try and get him out of the game so that his special military operation in Ukraine doesn't turn into a European war that we're all involved in, in the next few months or years.
Hamish De Bretton-Gordon, Lottie Hayton, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you for watching Frontline for Times Radio. For more, click subscribe on our YouTube channel. You can listen to Times Radio and you can read more about the war in Ukraine and global security with your Times digital subscription.